Welcome back to In-Depth Literature. Today we are here to cover some infamous true crime stories as well as two infamous true crime books slash new journalism, creative nonfiction novels slash biographies, which are The Executioner Song by Norman Mailer, covering the long tumultuous legacy of convict Gary Gilmore from Utah, as well as Lawrence Schiller's Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Now, some of you guys might be asking, why are you calling the video Mailer versus Schiller, or Schiller versus Mailer? Well, because Lawrence Schiller, who wrote this book among many others, and Norman Mailer are very well acquainted. They're related by sort of their occupation, their writing styles. They both work in the form of new journalism, known as creative nonfiction, sort of in the realm of Hunter Thompson, Truman Capote, that sort of genre. It's a really interesting genre, compelling genre that sort of uses the technique of traditional novel writing and combines it with real historical stories of real people, real events. And it's been a while since we've done any true crime books on this channel, so super excited to be back for that. I think we're going to start with Gary Gilmore today and The Executioner Song. And also, although Norman Mailer's writing style and is very akin to Lawrence Schiller's, the books are very similar. They are all also acquainted by, like I said, their occupation. And Norman Mailer got to know Lawrence Schiller quite well in detail throughout the writing of The Executioner Song. Lawrence Schiller actually hired Norman Mailer to write this book. Lawrence Schiller kind of did all the groundwork, the interviews, all that kind of stuff. And not that Norman Mailer didn't, but Norman Mailer, put his creative writing stamp on the story of Gary Gilmore. So appreciate you all being here. Thank you to all the new subscribers, all the new involvees of this channel, I guess we could say. So the story of Gary Gilmore begins roughly around the late 70s. After Gary Gilmore's release from prison in 1976, it's a long story in getting involved in Gary Gilmore's history of crime, but he grew up in reform school, came from a broken home, alcoholic, abusive father. The typical sort of recipe slash prescription for a life, unfortunately destined for crime. A fascinating story, yet controversial. I won't get into that, but Gary Gilmore spent most of his life in and out of reform school slash state prison. He was taken in roughly around 1976 by his cousin Brenda Nicole and her husband, I believe, and sort of in an attempt to rehabilitate him, to give Gary Gilmore another chance. And that's sort of where the later half of Gary Gilmore's story begins. Obviously, he has a whole slew of crimes. I think he was in prison for armed robbery, something to that degree, something fairly serious. Served about 12 years. So Gary Gilmore was a seasoned criminal by the late 70s by the time he got out, and despite his family and despite his own attempts to rehabilitate himself, he was unable to do so. But he was working at a shoe store with one of his family members. Obviously, he lived with his cousin Brenda Nicole, who was kind enough to take him in. And he also begun a relationship. And now this book is not only about Gary Gilmore, it's about the relationship that he shared with a lot of people, but primarily with Nicole Barrett slash Nicole Baker. And it talks about their tumultuous, very perverted love affair, but fascinating relationship all in all. And basically they were dating, but unfortunately Gary Gilmore's dark side began to come back to the surface, as it always does with certain individuals. And Gary Gilmore became abusive. He started to drink alcohol and become irresponsible. He was unable to hold down a job. And so as a result of this chaos, Nicole broke up with him, Nicole Baker slash Nicole Barrett. One of them's her married name. The other one is her maiden name. Obviously, I just can't remember which one's which. Forgive me. So as a result of his heartbreak, of his frustration, of his self-failure, Gary Gilmore goes on a very unfortunate murderous rampage and starts to rob gas stations. And his first victim is a man by the name of Max Jensen. He basically robs the place, tells the guy to get down on the floor, and then unlives him. For those of you not familiar with YouTube standards, we're going to try to stay away from very offensive, true crime words, just for the sake of not getting hopefully not getting too buried in the algorithm. Anyway, he kind of unlives Max Jensen, and the following day he robs a motel employee by the name of Ben Bushel. Basically does the same thing, robs him, tells him to get on the ground, and then unfortunately takes him out of this life. Obviously, to this day, there's really no known motive ever found other than Gary Gilmore's mental instability, his emotional instability, and obviously his willingness to self-destruct. And I think that's what's most compelling about the legacy of Gary Gilmore, or the lack thereof, is that he was just hell-bent on destruction. And he had brief periods of, maybe sobriety and emotional potential, social potential, but unfortunately was unable ultimately to conquer his demons. Now, before we sort of get into the whole meat and potatoes of the legacy of Gary Gilmore and sort of the writing from Norman Mailer's perspective, I just wanted to sort of discuss the relationship between Nicole Barrett and Gary Gilmore. It was fairly degenerate in the sense of the things that they got involved in. Some sexual degeneracy, deplorable activities, drugs, orgies, questionable things, just all around. But in essence, their relationship was very fascinatingly beautiful because they were sort of toxically dedicated to each other in this life and in the next. And when Gary Gilmore was on death row, they actually, Gary and Nicole sort of formed this suicide pact, and Nicole actually, sort of somehow smuggled drugs in to help Gary Gilmore to kill himself, and they were going to overdose on the same day, but both of them failed subsequently, and this sort of joint suicide plot was eventually discovered. Now, there's speculation and criticism as to whether Gary Gilmore was, when he got convicted of these murders, he was given the death penalty right away. And despite what most people might do, of course, some criminals have been known to do this, he actually accepts his fate and demands that they execute him as soon as possible. So that's kind of where sort of the interesting part of Gary Gilmore's legacy happens. Obviously he had the suicide pact with Nicole Barrett, and where sort of the criticism or speculation comes up in Gary Gilmore's story is that it was almost perceived as he was trying to punish himself, or he was accepting his fate. He was taking responsibility by taking himself out of this world. But really, in reality, he was sort of narcissistically and abusively controlling Nicole Barrett, and was willing to join in a suicide pact with the woman that he supposedly, allegedly loved, just in order to sort of narcissistically, telepathically control her in some way. Now, despite the fact that Nicole Barrett initially broke things off with Gary Gilmore, which, not that this was an excuse, but which Gary Gilmore blames his crimes on, the fact that his girl rejected him. Despite that, once he's in prison, she starts to kind of get sort of emotionally attached to him again. He starts writing letters, they start corresponding letters, and they start to sort of, rekindle their relationship. And you can definitely get the sense that Norman Mailer does this for us. He definitely, sort of describes and illustrates for us this obsessive, compulsive, very dark, twisted love between them. But it's also beautiful. They share a lot of, common ground. They both have rough upbringings. Gary Gilmore was, raised by an abusive family. Nicole Barrett was also abused mentally, emotionally, physically, all that stuff. So not only were they bonded in love, in physical love, emotional love, they were bonded by the trauma of not only their own lives, but the trauma that they created together. And Gary Gilmore, before he went to prison, before he committed these crimes, he started to physically, sort of abuse Nicole Barrett. And they had to do this whole police chase, and eventually, subsequently, he was arrested, obviously, and given the death penalty. But it wasn't that easy. And basically what the executioner's song is, it's broken up into two different points. The first part of the book, which to me is the most successful, is the early life, the early legacy of Gary Gilmore, sort of pre and post his prison sentence, and his relationship with his cousin Brenda Nicole, and some of the other figures that come up. There's a lot of Mormon influence in this book because, Utah, there's a lot of Mormons in Utah. And so he has this really fascinating relationship with Nicole Barrett. And that's where it's sort of for me personally, was really the meat and the potatoes, the really emotionally moving and poignant aspect of the novel was the first half. Now the second half, I would say roughly around, I mean the book is broken up into several different parts, but I would say roughly around page 500, it starts to go into excruciating detail of the court proceedings, and that's sort of where Lawrence Schiller, author of Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, the story of JonBenet. If I didn't mention that, this book is about JonBenet. We've kind of been, I mentioned the title of this, but I think I failed to mention that this book is a document of sort of speculating on this, the possible suspects of the JonBenet trials and the process. But again, going back to Executioner Song, the legacy of Gary Gilmore, or lack thereof. I keep saying legacy like he contributed something really great, but we'll just say legacy in terms of the life and history of Gary Gilmore. So first part of the book, obviously for me, was the best. I took a hell of a lot of sticky notes. And I think when you're writing about somebody, or when you're reading about somebody that's deplorable, that's less than a stellar human being, the notes get really interesting. And that's sort of where I sort of formed my judgment, or lack thereof, of Gary Gilmore, although I'm saying some bad things about the man. This book sort of illustrates for you how, it brings up that sort of lifelong controversial question: are evil people redeemable? Is there any light? Is there any healing? Is there any potential redemption in these evil people that walk among us? Now, Gary Gilmore, despite his crimes, was not, a sort of a mass serial killer. He wasn't, an Albert Fish or a Ted Bundy or somebody like that, but he was a fairly deplorable individual. But having said that, he was talented, he was charming, he was interesting. He had sort of the recognition and the cognitive ability and the emotional cognitive ability of discernment to realize that what he was doing was hurting the lives of others. Now, despite his good sense, despite his emotional sympathy or empathy, perhaps, he was still unable to stop himself from committing evil acts. And Norman Mailer definitely leaves you hanging and sort of chewing on your thumb with that question, is, what is morality? And also, what's also controversial about this book is that Gary Gilmore, not only controversial about the book, but also the legacy of Gary Gilmore, is that Gary Gilmore, demanded to be murdered, and he tried to kill himself. He was obviously not trying to get out easy. I mean, I guess he was by committing suicide. That was a pretty deplorable act to try to have that last ounce of control, but he ended up getting executed by the firing squad. But make no qualms about it, Gary Gilmore did not, other than trying the suicide pact with Nicole Barrett, he did not try to, fight the death penalty. He didn't try to say he was innocent. He said, I was guilty. I don't really know why I did this. I was upset. He had no animosity towards his victims. He was not stalking his victims prior to that. So it was not a particularly psychopathic, premeditated sort of unliving situation, we could say. It was a spur of the moment crime of opportunity, as they would call it. And Gary Gilmore sort of fell into this void of negativity that existed within him throughout his life, and this unquenchable desire for destruction and also self-destruction. And I think that's what's so shocking and compelling about Gary Gilmore's story, is that he was willing to sacrifice his entire life just to get revenge or to express anger. He never knew how to express anger. He never knew how to deal with his emotions, and Nicole Barrett breaking up with him, although that's a horribly pathetic excuse, that was sort of the camel that broke the straw that broke the camel's back. Also, before I interrupt myself, what's also controversial about this book is that it brings up thoughts about or contradictions about the death penalty. Should we send people to death? Whether your thoughts are, whether or not your thoughts are for or against that. Norman Mailer here sort of stays relatively neutral, but the whole trial was kind of a huge fiasco, because they had just gotten rid of the death penalty in several states, I think even in Utah at this time, and I forgot exactly what the case was, but you can look it up on Google and Wikipedia. This whole story of Gary Gilmore, a man willing to go back to death row and to sort of face his maker, was a big deal among sort of the progressive anti-death penalty community / movement that was taking place around this time, especially in a religious community like Utah. A lot of people said that we should not, use eye for an eye. We shouldn't be killing people. If we shouldn't be punishing people for the crimes that they themselves have committed. And legally speaking, in sort of the history of law and the history of redemption and the history of just crimes in general, I forgot what the exact court case is called, but several of those court cases that had been sort of way done and settled and over with sort of came back to the forefront. People started debating whether or not they were going to, sort of bring back the death penalty. But also what's extremely controversial about the Executioner song and Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer, if you guys want to give a little quick biography of him, he, ended up trying to unlive his wife. I don't know if he was trying to, unlive her, but he was trying to he physically and brutally attacked his own wife. So there's that. Norman Mailer's a little bit of a crazy screwball, narcissist type person himself, but he's a great writer if you like his style, if you like that style of new journalism, if you like that style of creative nonfiction. But Norman Mailer's portrayal of such a deplorable human being is also at the root of the controversy of Executioner's song. Some people love the book, some people hate the book. I personally found the book compelling, although, as you can see in my annotations right here, I wrote on the sticky note, why is Norman Mailer writing a book about this man? Because Gary Gilmore, even towards the end, some deplorable, horrible things come up about sort of things that Gary Gilmore was into and things that came to the surface. And although he's not the worst criminal, the worst serial killer, if you could even call him that, he was a pretty lousy serial killer. But prior to his last murderous rampage, he claims that he did murder somebody else in prison. So maybe Gary Gilmore was always deeply and 100% evil. It just never really became completely unleashed until, he had this falling out with Nicole Barrett. So there's some really interesting anecdotes about Gary Gilmore's time in prison, his time in reform school, the relationship or lack thereof that he had with his father, and the fascinating relationship that he had with Nicole Barrett and his cousin Brenda Nicole, and the relationship that he had with the court system. It was kind of like this push-pull, would sort of try to manipulate the lawyers and the judges and all these people, but at the end of the day, he was kind of stoically facing his fate, if you could say that about such a less than stellar human being. There is this stoic, sort of poetic, charming aspect of Gary Gilmore that a lot of people were just not happy that Norman Mailer sort of portrayed. But in addition to that, Gary Gilmore is a talented individual. He writes beautiful letters to Nicole Barrett and his family. He is an artist. There's actually some photos and pictures of these individuals, and I do want to show them because I'm filming all this on my phone currently until I get my new camera, and right now I haven't figured out how to get my footage on the camera to my Mac to make well-produced videos with overlays and pictures and all that. But for now, I can show you the pictures that we have in here. So we have some pictures of Gary Gilmore here. One when he was young in reform school, another a little later on at one of the state prisons. And there's actually a drawing in here that he did of Nicole Barrett. I'll show you some more pictures, some mug shots of Gary Gilmore, as well as some pictures of him with his mother at the state penitentiary. And he gets, oddly enough, gets more fit and more handsome as he gets older. He looks kind of bloated and kind of drunk in these pictures. But he had a pretty interesting relationship with his mother. I do suspect that there could have been some type of, very weird stuff going on. Make of that what you will. From the time he was a child, maybe he was, mistreated by both his mother and father. This is his cousin, Brenda Nicole, quite an attractive lady. That's her. And I think that's his uncle and his wife that he was also acquainted with, but that's his cousin that he sort of took him under his wing after he got out of prison. Now here is some pictures of the beautiful Nicole Barrett on this side here with a drawing, like I said, that Gary Gilmore did. That's Nicole Barrett with her son and her daughter. Another picture of her right here. So just a fascinating legacy, and I think it's so heartbreaking to read the story of Gary Gilmore, because his family and his lovers were, and his mother and Brenda Nicole and Nicole Barrett were trying so desperately to help this man that was just incurable. He had a mental illness, an emotional illness. This is him after he lost weight. He looks like a completely different man. This is a couple hours before he was executed. So how does Lawrence Schiller come into this? Lawrence Schiller was sort of hired, or sort of weaseled his way in to interview Gary Gilmore at the Utah State Prison. And Gary Gilmore, like I said, sort of had this push-pull relationship, and Lawrence Schiller had ulterior motives, to say the least. I mean, he was trying to give Gary Gilmore a voice. He wanted to write a book about Gary Gilmore, hence why we have the Executioner song. And he also wanted to buy the rights of Gary Gilmore's life story to make films and documentaries, so on and so forth. There was a miniseries made with Tommy Lee Jones, I think. But Lawrence Schiller got fairly close to Gary Gilmore, but Gary Gilmore knew that this Lawrence Schiller character was sort of trying to, poke and prod and sort of extract as much information as possible. Now, what Lawrence Schiller's real intentions were, whether it was fame or money or whatever, I mean, I can't claim to speculate on that, but I think he just wanted to get as much information from Gary Gilmore before Gary Gilmore was executed, so that he could give some information to Norman Mailer to write a novel to tell Gary's life story. Lawrence Schiller obviously became, well, first of all, Lawrence Schiller has a pretty high profile. He's very well connected. He took photos of Marilyn Monroe and JFK and Walter Matthau, big, huge Hollywood, sort of entrepreneur, and eventually became a true crime writer. But as far as the Executioner song is concerned, the legacy of Gary Gilmore, I did want to discuss, because this is in-depth literature, and this video would not be an in-depth literature video without sort of delving into the esoteric, delving into some of the lesser-known things discussed in popular literature. So interesting things here. Nicole later claimed the bouts of cold air would follow her and Gary, that Gary was haunted by evil spirits that he drew onto himself. Gary also had nightmares of execution, reincarnation. Gary Gilmore was obsessed with sort of this esoteric idea of reincarnation, and Gary Gilmore was convinced that he had lived many lives before, and he had been executed in one of these lives, and that this life was only a passing phase, and that if he was executed, he would definitely be reborn into some other being, some other form, physically, mentally, spiritually. And he believed that his artistic talents and his things he liked to read, or the people that he met, like Nicole Barrett, for example, were these divine sort of reincarnation connections that he had from a previous life. Gilmore also had a lot of sort of stoic philosophic thoughts on death. He was not afraid, supposedly, to face his own death, despite trying to unlive him and his girlfriend at the time. So also going forward, Gary's suicide, like we discussed, was it a form of stoic self-inflicted justice, or was it a narcissistic tool to control Nicole Barrett? I tend to think it was more of the latter. But it was just a desire for one last ounce of control. We talked we talked quite a bit about Israel Keyes, for example, who unlived himself before he was able to face his crimes. But towards the end, Gary Gilmore sort of, he didn't try any more suicide attempts, and he didn't try to, get Nicole Barrett to do that. And they sort of stoically faced their fate. And obviously, Gary Gilmore was executed. Nicole Gilmore Cole Barrett / Baker / Gilmore. She was never officially married to Gilmore. I don't think so. We shouldn't be calling her Nicole Gilmore. But Nicole Barrett / Baker, sort of rode off into the sunset. And there's some a couple obscure articles about the later life of Nicole Barrett. She turned to religion to sort of deal with the trauma that Gary Gilmore had put her through. And I think she knew that Gary Gilmore was an all-consuming evil force in her life, but a force that she could not reckon with, or that she could not resist, perhaps. Is there anything else I wanted to cover? It's very, very in-depth. There's a lot of information about Gary Gilmore. There's even some homoerotic tendencies that maybe come up in the Gary Gilmore's legacy. But a deplorable yet fascinating sort of romantic tale of one criminal's relationship with a woman that he loved, and sort of his legacy. And let's talk a little bit about the style of Norman Mailer, his writing. We've barely talked about our good friend Norman Mailer here. But his style, I guess, is obviously it's quote unquote new journalism. It is what's known as creative nonfiction. But if you did not, this could easily just be a fictional novel because of the way that it's written. I really like the way that his paragraphs are really spaced well far apart. He'll take a break, 2 breaks in between thoughts. That's a really interesting technique. He kind of writes a combination of Hemingway meets, I don't even know what you would say. Like, I don't know what writers to compare him to. He sticks to the facts, but obviously he's emoting. He's kind of making a lot of assumptions. He's making it sound more like a novel. He's making it sound more poetic, obviously, more romantic, more robust. He's throwing a lot of, I don't want to say flowery language, but he's throwing in a lot of things to make it read and sort of register as more like a novel. Sometimes Norman Mailer's sort of machismo, Henry Miller-esque sort of attitude towards sexuality and women sort of pops up, and some of the stuff that he writes is just kind of cringy and kind of vulgar. He'll just write really strange, off-putting sentences sometimes, but his writing is very inspiring. If you want to write a good story, I would definitely say that Norman Mailer is a good teacher. However, this book is far too long, in my opinion, and I think he should have just focused on Gary Gilmore and Nicole Barrett and the family. And, we didn't really need to know what all the lawyers were doing, and what the cops were doing, what the prosecutors were doing. It just got exhaustive. And but that's what this style is. It's known to be sort of in that vein of Truman Capote or Hunter Thompson, just sort of exhaustive, very over bloated, in my opinion, unnecessary information. But this book is definitely interesting in the genre of true crime because it is, like I said, written like a novel. So I think that's pretty much all I have to say about Norman Mailer's The Executioner Song. And now we are going to get into Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. In this, we'll talk a lot more about Lawrence Schiller in this particular segment. Now, this is not going to be a full analysis or a full speculation on who did it. That's a time for another video. There's other true crime channels that can do that way better than I can. But I want to talk a little bit about the book. And what was so compelling about Lawrence Schiller's thesis is that just the sheer amount of suspects in the JonBenet Ramsey case is what makes this case so compellingly unsolvable. Now, however, there are some esoteric / conspiratorial / things that do just not add up. Obviously, everybody knows that with JonBenet Ramsey. Lawrence Schiller sort of takes that technique that he learned, I believe, from Mr. Norman Mailer here, and puts it into this compelling true crime book called Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, JonBenet in the City of Boulder. This is the first book that I had read about JonBenet, and I definitely say it's one of the best if you want to get an overall sort of all-encompassing landscape-esque scope on all of the suspects, the legal proceedings, the ins and outs of the behavior of John and Patsy Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, and the sheer amount of suspects. Like I said, I mean, that's really the most shocking thing, is that they literally jump from one suspect to another, back to another, back to another, back to this part. I mean, it just never ends. I haven't been keeping up on what's going on with the JonBenet case lately. Unfortunately, JonBenet was unlived on the Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, I can't remember. I want to say it was Christmas morning of 1996. I remember this when I was a young kid. All of a sudden there was this, a toddler beauty queen on all the magazines, and just the nature of the crimes and the day of the crime. It's just, was it some type of Christmas inversion? We see that a lot. Stanley Kubrick had Christmas inversions in a lot of his films. Eyes Wide Shut, for example, was sort of an exploration of this esoteric inversion of Christmas. I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole, but was the JonBenet case, why did it happen on Christmas? Why? I mean, there's just a lot of whys. Why were there so many suspects? Why, I mean, I don't even know where to start with this, but I will say that Lawrence Schiller, sort of like Norman Mailer, sort of sort of writes in the same style. You can definitely see that he was influenced by Norman Mailer. But I think Lawrence Schiller is maybe a superior writer because he doesn't have any sort of machismo, corny, Hemingway-esque stuff that kind of pops in here. He doesn't have any. Not we get less of Norman Mailer's opinion, or we get less of Lawrence Schiller's personal bias or personal opinions versus Executioner's Song, where Norman Mailer's personality kind of slips in, which is kind of cool. It wasn't a bad thing. It was just like, okay, Norman Mailer, are you trying to tell the story of Gary Gilmore and Nicole Baker, or are you trying to, put your own spin on this? However, Lawrence Schiller kind of stays in the background and just tells you the basic facts. Now, who did it? We have to sort of briefly discuss that. Was it John and Patsy Ramsey? Was it the little brother Burke? Was it the nanny? Was it the Santa Claus? Was it Fleet White? Was it random sort of local sex offenders? Was it somebody? Was it a quote unquote intruder? What's up with the pineapple theory? Allegedly pineapple was found in JonBenet's intestines. Obviously, the scene of the crime was heavily tampered with, unfortunately. And there's just things about this that are just so compellingly preposterous. I mean, it's basically a how-to handbook on how to botch a case from the get-go. So another very strange aspect to this case occurs on 346. One of the investigators is named Woodward. It says, that evening, Woodward called two sources she had cultivated during the investigation. One of them, an attorney for the Ramseys, told her that they had already considered Psalm 118 because of the 118,000 ransom demand amount. They had also discovered a passage in verse 27, God is the Lord, which hath shewed us light. Bind the sacrifice with cords, even unto the horns of the altar. Then Woodward's police source confirmed that the detectives had visited Hoverstock. What the source did not reveal was that they had found John Ramsey's Bible open to Psalm 118 during their initial search of the house. Okay, so when I tell, for example, when I'm debating with my father about conspiracies and sacrifices and stuff like that, it all sounds crazy, but there's actually some information that Lawrence Schiller is alluding to here, that John Ramsey had his Bible open to that psalm, which reads, God is the Lord, which hath shewed us light. Bind the sacrifice with cords, even unto the horns of the altar. So if that is not strangely, bizarrely, shockingly scary, then what is? Was JonBenet some type of sacrifice on Christmas Day? Just the sheer amount of media attention that JonBenet got, and the whole story, just the legacy of JonBenet, I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like it, at least within that time period. Obviously we've had, other missing children and unlived children. But in terms of the early 90s, when I was growing up, JonBenet was the biggest, most brutal, crime to a young person that ever occurred. So there's a lot of different things that I could go into here. The botched investigation, a lot of subterfuge from the courts and the police stations. A lot of people believe that JonBenet and Patsy John Ramsey, who names their daughter after them in that manner? You got John Ramsey and JonBenet. Anyway, there's a theory that either JonBenet was doing deplorable things to his daughter JonBenet. It's also a theory that JonBenet was wetting her bed and that the mother struck out in a moment of anger. There's another theory that the brother was fighting somehow, or had been jealous of his younger sister JonBenet for many years and hit her over the head with a flashlight, knocked her out. The parents covered up for the brother. I personally don't necessarily believe that, but there is something obviously that happened in that house. There's theories that she spent a little bit too much time with the Santa Claus guy that year, and whoever did this was most likely not an intruder. That's almost impossible to believe, because the person would have had to have known how to get around that house. And just the sheer fact that JonBenet was allegedly unlived while the whole family was quote unquote sleeping. It just doesn't add up. If it wasn't, I think the intruder theory was staged to make it look not, to make it look like an intruder. The back, the little, the window in the suitcase, right underneath the window. Who would prop up a suitcase to? I mean, there's a million other things you could use to kind of get yourself out of a window. You wouldn't use a wobbly suitcase that's maybe this thin. Also, allegedly, there was a scream heard by one of the next door neighbors. Whether or not that was JonBenet remains to be seen. And there was some uncooperative sort of behaviors by JonBenet and Patsy Ramsey. Some people think that Patsy Ramsey and JonBenet during the interviews look kind of suspicious. It's hard to tell, but obviously something happened in that house with that family, I suspect. I'm not saying that I know for sure. Now, whether it was John Ramsey doing deplorable things to his daughter, or whether it was some type of elite sacrifice for publicity and money, obviously not even to discuss the ransom note, the sketchiness of the ransom note. It just doesn't read convincingly. It's far too long. If you guys are familiar with the case, the ransom note is like maybe 2 or 3 handwritten pages from, I have to mention, a pen and a pad of paper that was originally kept on the kitchen counter or the living room counter. I think it's the kitchen counter of John and Patsy Ramsey's house. So, if the guy was broke in and had all this premeditated plans to sort of unlive and do terrible things to JonBenet, don't you think he might have thought, if it was that premeditated, don't you think he would have brought his own pen and paper? There's just some things that just do not add up. Obviously, Fleet White kind of comes into the picture. Some people speculate that it might have been him. I don't really have an opinion on that because I'm not that familiar with Fleet White, but obviously he had a falling out with the Ramseys. Unfortunately, Patsy Ramsey died of cancer, I think, in the mid 2000s. JonBenet is still alive, as well as Burke Ramsey. Obviously, everybody knows that awkward interview with Burke Ramsey with Dr. Phil, of all people, where Dr. Phil says, "Did you do something to your sister?" And Burke Ramsey goes, "Absolutely not." And some people claim that he was, awkward. He was in the heat of the moment. He was nervous. Who knows? I would hate to believe that Burke Ramsey did it, but I think in terms of how this case has been so unsolvable, he would be maybe the most likely suspect, just for the sake of the fact that initially, because he was so young, nobody really suspected him. But however, there is some other information that comes up that one of the initial 911 calls, it's just really sketchy. Patsy Ramsey sort of answers the phone, and nobody knows how, you never know how you would act in that sort of situation if you found a loved one, deceased or unlived or whatever, or harmed. But she goes, "We have a kidnapping." It just sounds a little weird. There's rumors that you can hear something in the background. You can hear Burke in the background saying something, and Patsy Ramsey says, "What did you do?" Initially, that why that's suspicious is because John and Patsy Ramsey claim that Burke Ramsey was asleep during the finding of JonBenet, as well as the initial 911 call. They claim that Burke Ramsey was upstairs sleeping. There's evidence to suggest that perhaps he was not. One of the main investigators that came to the house, I think if we can find her name here, Detective Linda Arndt, actually suspected that something was amiss, that JonBenet and the entire family, Patsy, were acting a little bit suspect, and it's kind of unknown what exactly she meant by that. So John Ramsey actually did make some phone calls. They were planning to go on vacation like the day that they found JonBenet. What's also suspect is Fleet White and John Ramsey were ordered by, I think, one of the detectives. I can't say for sure if it was Linda Arndt, but one of the initial detectives at the scene, they sent John Ramsey and Fleet White to go search the house for evidence, which is kind of weird. You shouldn't be doing that. That's a conflict of interest. I've never even heard of that ever happening, because that's the police job. That's the investigator's job. Anyway, John Ramsey, lo and behold, finds his daughter. And what's also weird is that Fleet White had been in that basement a couple hours before that, I believe, and claims that he turned on the light and didn't see anything, or that he I forgot whether he turned the light on or not, but he claims he couldn't see beyond a certain place. A couple hours later, John Ramsey goes in that exact space, finds his daughter. There's obviously a lot of suspicious paraphernalia, suspicious evidence that was tampered with. JonBenet grabs his deceased, unlived daughter, carries her up the stairs, meanwhile tampering this entire crime scene, which is completely and utterly ludicrous. Why he was allowed to go and search for evidence is just beyond me. Why Fleet White was there doing that is also suspicious. But anyway, they tampered the entire thing, just screwed up the whole thing, and he puts his a daughter on the floor upstairs, I think wherever the investigators were, maybe living room, kitchen, can't remember exactly. And I think Linda Arndt sort of mentioned something that he was sort of crying, or maybe crocodile crying, who knows for sure. But he kind of gets down like this and sort of looks at Patsy, and there was this weird little exchange, like they were up to something, or they knew something, or something was planned, something had been staged. So unfortunately, the whole entire case of JonBenet was, not only was it extremely suspicious, but it was just botched from the get-go. But going a little bit back to Lawrence Schiller, what's interesting is that sort of by the time Lawrence Schiller is writing these true crime novels, or these true crime books, he is, maybe still motivated by money and fame, but he's definitely respectfully sort of presents the case of JonBenet, and he goes over every single potential suspect and sort of leaves the reader open for their own interpretation. He doesn't really force a theory, but this is a fascinating book, and definitely a page turner. Sort of encapsulate or briefly discuss Lawrence Schiller's thesis is, what is it here? It says here, if someone is ever charged with JonBenet's murder and the case comes to trial, only then will a jury have the right to pass judgment. We should not consider John and Patsy anything less than innocent unless and until a guilty verdict is pronounced on one or both of them by 12 of their fellow citizens. I happen to kind of disagree with his thesis here, but I know it is hard to maintain that level of objectivity when confronted with the facts of a 6-year-old's unliving, an unexceptionally beautiful and charming child. The urge to blame someone is deep-seated, but we are obliged to remember that presumption of innocence, for however may ultimately be charged with JonBenet's death, is absolutely entitled to a fair chance and a fair trial. That startling notion, rooted in English common law, that holds every man and woman equal and equally innocent before the bar of justice. So just a very, very compelling book. My cover is falling off here. This took me some time to get through, just mainly because of the subject matter. Just some interesting things. Throughout my research on this case, Schiller says, I was then and am still convinced that neither John nor Patsy ever asked each other, did you cause JonBenet's death? Now, how he knows that is up for debate. It is entirely possible that neither of the Ramseys ever dared to ask such a question. That's interesting too. Did the Ramseys maybe know on some subconscious level, or maybe some crime took place somehow, miraculously, without the other spouse knowing? That's also a possibility, and maybe John or Patsy in this case, would have taken it to her grave. It is that way, despite the tragedy engulfing this couple, they would at least be spared the horror of the question, or losing their family also, which he failed to mention. Even if one or both had momentary doubts, or worse, persistent doubts, I think the question was never asked. To do so would have had to place such strain on the relationship that it could surely have ended their marriage. And also, that's kind of where the issue of Burke Ramsey comes in. And a lot of people, on forums speculate that if indeed Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's brother, did commit this crime, that the parents may be covered for him because they were afraid that he would go to prison or something. I don't think they would have sent a toddler to prison, but you never know. On the other hand, convinced or not, I still wanted to verify whether anyone I interviewed could offer some indication that the Ramseys might have questioned each other's innocence. It wasn't long, however, before I was fairly certain once again that John would never raise the subject. If he actually knew Patsy was involved in their child's unliving, then there was no need for discussion. If he was merely suspicious, he would still refrain, and if he doubted Patsy's word, then why ask? For how would he ever know if any answer she gave him was honest? Soon enough, I encountered all the other theories of the crime. Santa did it. John was doing bad things to his daughter, and Patsy caught them in the act. Patsy went crazy over her daughter's bedwetting. The theories went on and on. Yet the more I learned about the murder, the unliving from those investigating the case, the more clearly I saw, as did some of the detectives, that no one theory included all the evidence. So that's kind of interesting too. In fact, the more I was told by law enforcement about what they knew, the less confident I became of ever finding an answer for myself. So that's what's so strange about, not only was the case botched, not only was there way too many suspects, you have to speculate that maybe this case was created and manufactured in order to be unsolvable. Maybe it was some kind of elite, millionaire sacrifice. People in high positions of power with a lot of money do some really sick things. As we know, if you watch some of my other videos, we haven't done a lot of conspiracy videos lately, and I'm not saying that this whole JonBenet case is a satanic conspiratorial sacrifice, but it definitely makes you go, huh? So I think we'll kind of close out this video then. Forgive me if I missed any important elements in the story of Gary Gilmore or the case of JonBenet. Obviously, two totally different genres of true crime, but I definitely recommend both of these books. You're definitely going to want to have these in your true crime / investigative creative journalism, fiction, creative nonfiction section. That's probably more what Norman Mailer is, and Lawrence Schiller, although he sort of writes in the style of creative nonfiction or sort of creative journalism. It's definitely more of just like a classic true crime novel. And we do have some other true crime stuff coming up in the future. I'm not sure when we're going to read it, but we're going to start that Jack the Ripper book, actually. See if I can grab it here and show it to y'all. Patricia Cornwell. I don't feel like grabbing it right now, but Portrait of a Killer by Patricia Cornwell. I really appreciate y'all for stopping by my channel this evening, for spending some of your, Monday evening with us. And make sure you guys check out the playlist, the newest content. Make sure you guys follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist. Feel free to share this video with all your friends. Comment your theories down below. Let me know if you're familiar with the case of JonBenet Ramsey or the case of Gary Gilmore, or if you've read Norman Mailer's Execution Song, or if you've read Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. We will see you all next time.